Hi there, welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I want to talk about the Ethereum risk metric, and this is something that I discussed around 2 weeks ago in another video. And as you can see, I was talking about how Ethereum is pretty close to bottoming against its Bitcoin pair, and I was discussing how the latest risk was hovering around 0.05 to 0.015. And this typically shows us a relative bottom for Ethereum versus Bitcoin, just historically speaking. And if we pop on the 0.90 to 95, you can also see that in overvaluation territories, Ethereum tends to outperform Bitcoin for certain parts of the cycle, and then Bitcoin tends to outperform Ethereum in certain parts of the cycle. So in this video, I was discussing how the Ethereum risk metric is actually really undervalued, and that I was converting some of my Bitcoin to Ethereum. And I was also discussing about how Ethereum entered into its lower logarithmic regression band, which are these three lines, and it essentially just plots the Ethereum price in a logarithmic regression trend line here. And as you can see, it has a pretty good track record. So back in 2015, when Ethereum was first entered into the market, you can see it had this sort of spike really high up, and then it came back down, and then it follows this. If it basically just goes back into these ranges here every time we have a bear market, or Ethereum is just really undervalued like it is now. And notice how Ethereum really never got down into this level until now, until it finally broke off of its Ethereum off of this trend line here, which is also a similar thing that it did back over, which is a similar thing where it did back over here, where it finally sort of broke down into those levels. And even though this price was pretty much the same, it shows you how it was following this trend line, followed breakdown. And this has just been a really long time coming. Every time it hits this level, it sort of bounced from it, and then we also saw this lower high in 2024. So in that video, I was discussing how the Ethereum valuation was getting into that lower logarithmic regression band, into the fair value, which is currently at 1600, but back then it was at 15. It was around 1620 compared to 1670. So you can see this regression trend line continues up over time, meaning that it basically considers the fact that Ethereum's price will outperform, or will go up during a relative period of time. Let's say in 2028 would probably be the fair value logarithmic regression would probably be around 2900 or so. So I wanted to talk about the relative valuation of Ethereum versus Bitcoin. And normally people look at it like Ethereum divided by Bitcoin, which is totally normal, and it's kind of hard to understand. Like my Ethereum is worth only 0.03 satoshis compared to Bitcoin. But I want to reverse this calculation. So if you take the reverse of that and you say you divide Bitcoin by Ethereum, it becomes a little bit more clear here. So as you can see, in April, one Ethereum or one Bitcoin would have gotten you 51 Ethereum, 54 Ethereum, 53 Ethereum. And now one Bitcoin only gives you 44 Ethereum, which I say only, but yeah, it's definitely gone down a lot compared to what it was at before. And you can see that Ethereum has its moments where it outperforms Bitcoin for a majority of the cycle, and then Bitcoin outperforms Ethereum for the majority of the cycle. And you can see this played out at the beginning here in 2016, 2019, 2021, and now again in 2024, around 4 years later. It's just been a really slow bleed. The market likes to take the elevator up, but the stairs down every single time Ethereum Bitcoin was pumping. Everyone was saying alt season's coming, but it only led to lower lows on Ethereum's risk, or Ethereum's relative valuation compared to Bitcoin. So yeah, one Bitcoin got you around, or one Ethereum, one Bitcoin got you around 11 Ethereum back in 2021 in November, and then in only 4 years later, or I say only, but 4 years later, it got you around 53 Bitcoin, or 53 Ethereum, my bad. And you can see that recently, Ethereum has actually started to outperform Bitcoin on its Bitcoin pair. And I wanted to showcase another point in history where this occurred. So we sort of bottomed out at this level here in September of 2019, and that actually corresponded to September 2019 corresponded to Bitcoin going to around these levels in 2019 here. So one Bitcoin was $10,000, but if you go to 2019 for Ethereum, one Ethereum was $329. So Bitcoin was definitely outperforming Ethereum in this period right here, but we saw a little bit of a jump in the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation right here, and then it sort of hit this lower high right here, and I can sort of see Ethereum Bitcoin doing the same thing right now. So if you can see here, we hit a low of 0.018, and then now Ethereum Bitcoin is at 0.02. So I wouldn't be surprised if Ethereum Bitcoin sort of rolled back over just a little bit here and got maybe rejected by this level of the logarithmic regression trend line, and sort of came back over and tested this lower high structure of, or this period at which Ethereum was sort of not breaking down into the lower logarithmic regression trend line. I can sort of see this being a big line in the sand for Ethereum, and maybe we come back down here and test the top half of the logarithmic regression trend line. Maybe go down to 2300, 2200, or worst case scenario, we retest this fair value line at 1700 or 1800, and then we can sort of see Ethereum outperform Bitcoin for the majority of the cycle, or the rest of the cycle, I should say, because this year is coming really close to an end now, and Bitcoin tends to bottom in this part of a cycle. Like, for example, we saw Bitcoin top out in the post-halving year of 2021. Similarly, we're also in the post-halving year right now, and 2025 is coming pretty close to an end. Only 7 months left. I could see us hitting around 120k, 130k maybe, and then sort of getting that bear market like you always get in the post-halving year, in the pre-halving, in the bear market year, basically. So I also want to talk about the ROI analysis. So if you compare Bitcoin's price 3 years ago, let's say in 2022, if you look at Bitcoin's price in August of 2022, and you actually compare that to where Ethereum was in August 2022, you can sort of see that it was keeping up with Bitcoin. So the charts look pretty much very similar, right? So, but when you consider what Bitcoin's at right now, around 104k right now, we hit a new all-time high in January of 2025. In January of 2024, Ethereum wasn't even at a new all-time high. Ethereum was only at 3,800. The all-time high for Ethereum was 4,800 in 2021. So this kind of showcases the relative valuation of Ethereum versus Bitcoin, and why you should look at this, because it's essentially been bleeding against Bitcoin for 4+ years now, and only now it's starting to go up. So I just wanted to showcase the how the ROI compared to the different assets are and why it's important. If you guys like this content, please be sure to like and subscribe, comment if you want more. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.